Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Welcome to the course Culturally Responsive Built Environments. Today we are going to discuss about the protection of the world cultural and natural heritage, especially the kind of process how it takes in the UNESCO's World Heritage listing. So from the continuation of previous lecture on the conservation issues and challenges, we briefly introduced with the criteria for selection of the World Heritage List and how they have to meet the requirements of this outstanding universal value. And there have been certain criteria, which about a list of 10 criteria which has been listed, and it has to meet at least 1 out of 10. So some of these we have already discussed in our previous class. So for instance, the representation of masterpiece of human creative genius, and it talks about also the important interchange of human values over a span of a time or within a cultural area of the world, and developments of architecture and technology. Like this, there are a series of 10 criterion which has been laid out. Like for instance, we also talk about the bear a unique and at least exceptional testimony to a cultural tradition or a civilization, and talks from the architectural or technological ensemble, and the outstanding example of a traditional human settlement, land use, or related to the urban planning. So it's not only related to the tangible elements of it, but the intangible elements, how they actually evolve these tangible forms. So within the same lecture, we have just introduced you to the operational guidelines, the latest one, which I'm referring to 12th July 2017. And these are how to implement this, the discussions what happened from the World Heritage Convention. So basically, these are set of operational guidelines for implementing the World Heritage Convention. So this has been organized in collaboration with the World Heritage Convention and the UNESCO, and this is available in the internet, which I have just given you. The World Heritage, if you go to the UNESCO website, from there, if you look at the criterion of selection, then there is already a hyperlink given on the operational guidelines. So my advice is for you to refer the latest ones. So you had an update of, so in fact, this 1972, where actually this World Heritage Convention has actually adopted, and it has invited various member states of UNESCO, and they basically discussed about what are the ways how we can identify the proper identification and the protection, conservation, and presentation of the world's heritage. So this particular committee have established, this particular convention have established a World Heritage Committee and a World Heritage Fund, because there's an operational aspect of who does this and how, what kind of money, economic sources, you know. So there's a, and this has been in operation since 1976. This World Heritage Convention aims at mainly the identification of heritage, because if you look at the present situation, and many of these heritage contexts have not even been identified. Some of them are located in remote areas, or sometimes below the earth, you know. So they're not even discovered. So which means how we can identify, and once whatever they are identified, how we can protect them. That is where the preservation aspects, and as well as so that the evidence, the rich evidence is not lost. Conservation and the presentation. The last part which they talk about is the transmission, because why we are doing all this conservation? Because this whole rich knowledge is actually transmitted to the future generations of cultural and natural heritage of outstanding universal, because there are many things which we can learn from our past and the history and the mankind, how they have evolved, how they have developed, and how they have sustained. So what we can learn from history, so that the history cannot be forgotten. So it is there within our identity, within our landscape. So who are the users, the key users of these operational guidelines? Number one, the state parties to the World Heritage Convention, so respective the national associations which actually represent the state parties, and the Intergovernmental Committee for the Protection of the Cultural and Natural Heritage of Outstanding Universal Value. So the members who form the Intergovernmental Committee, it is also useful for them. And the UNESCO World Heritage Center, which acts as secretariat to the World Heritage Committee, and the advisory bodies to the World Heritage Committee, because they set up the different advisory bodies based on various different interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary experts come and formulate within those advisory domains. And coming to the bottom level, the site managers, the stakeholders, and the partners in the protection of World Heritage properties. So who actually, like for instance in Indian context, like the ASI, which takes care of that heritage precincts, or any other organization which is involved in. So basically the site managers who is looking at this kind of, not only the protection part of it, but the management process of it. So it also, this particular report also talks about, of course, I'm just briefing you out a few important points which will be useful for the students. And one, it talks about the boundaries. What are the legal boundaries when the heritage property is determined, and what are the kind of legal boundaries it has? It has to provide, for instance, and what kind of restrictions it also imposes, not only on the property, but it also implements on the surrounding precincts. So it could include, if you look at this, it could include the immediate setting of the nominated property, because for instance, if we are talking about Bhojpur, it is not just only the temple, but the immediate setting which has many rich evidences like the mounds which they identified, or some of the inscriptions which are on the rock inscriptions of the map. So they are all within the premises, within the immediate precincts. So still some more research has to be done. And the other important aspect is the important views. So if a heritage property is declared, but so these views, how they connect to the people by looking at a property, by looking at a particular heritage precincts. So how it brings value to that place, how a person can view. Just imagine if you have the boundary and then on the next to it a person builds a 20-storied building. Obviously it is going to block the whole view of it. So is there any kind of bylaws, is there any kind of codal regulations which can also control and also provide certain views? And other areas or attributes that are functionally important as a support to the property and its protection. Imagine you have the heritage property and someone wants to set up an industrial zone next to it. Obviously it is going to create certain impacts on the property. There is a chances that very much that it might deteriorate the fabric of that place. So these are all some of the, it extends not just only the building and the conservation considerations, but it goes back to the planning considerations. So that is where we talk about the buffer zone. So this buffer zone itself is a very obligatory mechanism, and still a lot of work is going on in how to appropriate these buffer zones and the core zones. And there are various mechanisms which has been developed, because it depends on the details of size, characteristics, and the authorized uses of buffer zone. Because what is within the property limit and what is within the, what is the core zone and what is the buffer zone, and so this indicate the boundaries of the property and its buffer zone. So this we actually understand that there is a certain control measures. It could be the legal control measures, and this could be the operational measures, and it is also they're all reflecting the aesthetic sense of that particular heritage property, as well as the how it is actually communicating, because how it is bringing an essence to that place. So apart from the legal constraints, the control mechanisms, how they can appropriate this place, it is equally also important to talk about the management systems. And every nominated property should have an appropriate management plan or documented management system which must specify the outstanding universal value of the property should be preserved, preferably through participatory means. So the management system, this is where the community participation, this is where the local stakeholders can also take part of how it can be managed well. In fact, there are a few points this particular report talks about the effective management systems, both from a short-term, medium and the long-term mechanisms. So one of the important criteria which they talk about, a thorough shared understanding of the property by all. We talk about in the principles of conservation also, we talked about the shared meaning, how a heritage is a shared resource. So it is basically a shared understanding of the property by all stakeholders, including the use of participatory planning and stakeholder consultation process. So if we have to involve stakeholder consultation process, we have to involve people, agencies within the geographical premises who are working and who are operating. And we also have to draft a cycle of planning, implementation, monitoring, evaluation and feedback. In fact, when we are talking about monitoring, because it is not just you set up a heritage nomination and then you forget it, but how we can periodically check it, how we can periodically verify and upgrade it, So this particular mechanisms has to be also set up. An assessment of vulnerabilities of the property to social, economic, sometimes it could be also climatic pressures, as well as the monitoring of the impacts of trends and proposed interventions. Like in our previous lectures, we also talked about the Pitalkhora caves, how the cave, because of various wind erosions or various climatic factors, how it is gradually deteriorating. So how they try to channelize the water channels through a different route, so that in order to protect this particular rich cave shelters. The development of mechanisms for the involvement and coordination of various activities between different partners and stakeholders. So this is all how we can actually develop certain mechanisms so that different stakeholders can come on one platform to talk about one holistic issue. Another aspect is how the necessary resources, including the funding, including any particular material resources, any particular human resources, how we can procure all this and how we can designate, because everything occurs with a cost, and so how we can equally distribute them. Then not only the allocation of the resources, but it also talks about how we can enhance the capacity building program so that it can bring awareness. The last component which we just talked about is the transmission, so that people get aware of these particular heritage issues and the development issues. So how to set up, the last one is very important, that how to set up an accountable and transparent description of how the management system functions, because there's no hidden agendas behind it. It should be transparent and every body is accountable of what they are doing and how they are doing, and what are the resources allocated and how they have distributed and how they are functioning. So I'll just briefly give you an overview of how this process of the inscription of properties in the World Heritage List. So this is completely based on the operational guidelines report. So the first thing, if we look at it, is the preparation of nominations. So at the end of the report, we have certain annexures, which I'll just briefly show you on that. These are certain guidelines. We have the Annex 3, So basically the guidelines on the inscription of specific types of properties on the World Heritage List. So obviously there are certain non-governmental organizations like ICOMOS, the International Council of Monuments and other sites, and the IUCN, and these are all also take an important role in this whole process. So today I will just briefly give you an overview on the cultural landscapes. So one of the component which talks about is within that identification process is the cultural landscapes, towns, canals and routes. So for instance, today we talk about the Silk Route. So that is also we talk about a route, like in Pitalkhora caves, how the ancient cave dwellers, how the trade routes have established and how the sea routes have established. So obviously they are all certain connections and networks within these indigenous communities. And the World Heritage Committee, it has identified and defined several specific types of cultural and natural properties, and they have adopted certain guidelines to facilitate the evaluation, how to evaluate. And where we talk about in the very much in the beginning of our conservation lectures, we talk about the historic integrity, the authenticity and the significance and the context. So because these are all has to be to what kind of integrity it bears, and this particular property or this particular settlement or this particular landscape it bears, and what is the outstanding universal value for it. So they have classified into cultural landscapes, historic towns and town centers, heritage canals and heritage routes. So today we'll just briefly discuss about the cultural landscapes. So here the cultural landscapes fall in three main categories. Number one, the most easily identifiable is clearly defined landscape designed and created intentionally by man. So this could be the kind of gardens, whether embraces garden or a parkland landscape constructed for not only for an aesthetic reasons, but quite often they are associated with many religious and other monumental buildings and ensembles. So in fact, one of the example which I would like to bring to your notice is the Hirajumi temples, gardens and archaeological sites which are representing the Buddhist Pure Land in Japan. So in fact these particular temples and these gardens, they represent the Buddhist Pure Land, and which comprises of 5 sites including the sacred Mount Kinkyesan, and it features the West government offices dating from 11th to 12th centuries, and when Hirajumi was the administrative center. But this particular, the realm was based on the cosmology of Pure Land Buddhism, which actually has spread up in 8th century. And it represented the pure land of Buddha that people aspire to after death, as well as peace of mind in this life. So this this kind of setting, and if you look at the map, you see the nominated properties here, and if you look at the kind of buffer zone, which has the immediate precincts have also been demarcated as a buffer zone, which will have definitely a specific implications of the buildings and the development control over there. So in combination of this indigenous Japanese nature worship and Shintoism, this Pure Land Buddhism developed a concept of planning and garden design that was unique to Japan. So this is a kind of base how the Japanese gardens have developed gradually, and this is one of the rich evidence of, so it's not only just properties here, but it talks about the whole the garden setup. So the landscape has given a shape and a meaning of today's the Japanese gardens. And another example which I would like to give you is the cultural landscape and archaeological remains of the Bamiyan Valley, which is in today's Afghanistan. And if you look at the overall site of it, and this particular valley represents the artistic and religious developments from the 1st to 13th century, which is characterized by Bhaktriya, integrating various influences in the Gandhara school of Buddhist art. Of course, you might have heard about Gandhara from the ancient mythological stories of Mahabharata, the wife of Dhritarashtra, the Gandhara. So obviously the place the Gandhara hails from that particular region, and how Buddhism has spread out, and how this particular this particular place also integrates the various cultural influences of Gandhara school of Buddhist art. So this contains various Buddhist monastic ensembles, sanctuaries, as well as fortified edifices from the Islamic period. So there's a little blend of from the Buddhist and the Islamic buildings and their representations. So the site is also a testimony to the tragic destruction by the Taliban of 2 standing Buddha statues, which shook the world. And so basically there's recent destructions of Taliban, because how Talibans also have attacked these particular historic sites. They are not going to get anything, but someone is attacking a particular historic significant value, so it is affecting the values of that particular rich culture and that belonging. So what you see here is kind of an overall view of this Buddhist period in the Islamic country. The second category is the organically evolved landscape. So basically this again falls subdivided into 2 categories. One is a relict or a fossil landscape, which actually shows the evolutionary process that might have come to an end at some time in the past, either abruptly or over a period. Its significant distinguishing features are, however, still visible and in material form. So which means these particular, like you are talking about ice age, you are talking about the development of flora and fauna, so how they are still visible, where it might have stopped, or it might have taken a different shape altogether, but still how it is still visible. The second form which they talked about is the continuing landscape, which retains an active social role in contemporary society, closely associated with the traditional way of life in which the evolutionary process is still in progress. So in fact, some parts of the Europe where the ice age, the impacts of the ice age is still in progress, and how the trees are able to adapt to the present ongoing climate as well. At the same time, it exhibits significant material evidence for its evolution over time. So one example in the Australia, both if you look at the northern edge and the southern edge, there are some interesting sites of Rivers Lake and Narcoot, which are situated both in north and south of Australia, because when the Australia divides from the Antarctican belt, and so there are some rich evidences of the greatest fossil sites. So what you see here is, the good record of how the flora and the fauna have developed, and the mammals have mammals have developed. So this particular site illustrates the key stages of Australia's unique fauna. So it also talks about many evolution of certain mammals and vertebrates, So basically this is one of the important evidence, rich evidence. So you can see the map of it, and you have this kind of the whole national park, and how it is a rich reserves. So obviously it is, if you go to the Australia or the New Zealand, which has much ecological reserves and which has a very rich evidences of such kind of fossil evidences, which are very rare today. And now it's not just only about a particular space, but how a particular context of or spread over for almost a region of Europe, and it's a cross-boundary evidences, I can say, or we can call it as the transboundary properties, which has spread in 12 countries. The heritage is not just limiting to only a country or a particular state, but it can stretch through various, almost through the continent. So one of the good example which I would like to bring to your account is the ancient and the primeval beech forest of Carpathians and other regions of Europe. So basically this stretches almost about 12 countries within Europe and former the Soviet Union countries as well. So it talks about since the end of last ice age, European beech spread from a few isolated refuge areas in Alps, Carpathians, Dinarides, Mediterranean and Pyrenees over a short period for a few thousand years in a process that is still ongoing. So this is basically related to the tree's adaptability and tolerance to different climatic, geographic and physical conditions. So how the natural flora and fauna, how they adapt to these different climatic conditions, because since from the ice age, these particular landscapes are able to adapt to various conditions. So if you look at the map of the Europe, so these are the potential sites which are recognized, and so they're spread out from Spain to Italy to almost in the Ukraine and in the northern part of Europe. So if you go to the UNESCO website, you'll find all the details on the respective maps of these zones. And I'll show you a few of it, like how the beech primeval forest of the Carpathians, how they share the cross-boundary relationship between the Ukrainian and Slovak territories. So there's enough documentation. So because before any state party going for nominating any particular property, obviously a thorough study has to be done and rich evidences has to be collected, and then only it has to go to the application procedure. So now in Italy, you can see this, you have the core zone and you have the buffer zone. So obviously it is having certain control mechanisms. And the final category of these cultural landscapes, which talks about the associative cultural landscape. It's not just only the material form, but how the non-material form, how by virtue of powerful religious, artistic and cultural associations of the natural element rather than material cultural evidence, which may be insignificant or even absent. So for instance, a good example how the intangible elements also associate these particular cultural landscapes. For instance, we give an example of Tongariro National Park in New Zealand in the Polynesian and the Melanesian cultures. Especially the communities, how they associate their migration patterns and how they have certain religious significance to the Maori people, and they also act as a kind of potential symbolic, and which also brings a spiritual connection between the human community and the natural environment. So basically these particular natural environment, it is associated with various spiritual connections between how humans connect with the natural environment. So there's all intangible part associated with this. Now what they do, so this is just to brief you about the cultural landscapes and how they're classified, and I've just thrown some examples to relate. Now the procedure of how it is, so basically the state parties, they are basically encouraged to prepare the tentative list with the participation of wide variety of stakeholders. It could be the organizations, it could be the communities, it could be the curators, it could be any archaeological, so any governmental and non-governmental agencies, including the site managers of local and the regional governments, local communities. And then so they do a lot of surveys and they do document certain evidences and they submit the tentative list. Okay, these are the properties which could be nominated for the tentative list to the secretariat at least 1 year prior to the submission of any. And then the state parties are always encouraged to re-examine and resubmit the tentative list at least every 10 years. So which means periodically we are progressively we are working on it. And they are mostly submitted they are supposed to submit in at least two languages. One is the English and the French. and they have certain formats. A sample of the format I'm in the annexures 2A and 2B, which is for the transnational and transboundary nominations. So basically what you see here is a kind of form, and you have the details of the name of the property, name of the national component part. Imagine if the property is shared between the Bangladesh and India, the Sundarbans. Obviously you have to talk about who are these parties, relevant parties, and what area we are talking about in terms of the geographic place, and we talk about the transnational and transboundary future nomination, and what are the competitions. So here if you can see these criteria what we showed in the earlier class and even today's class, the list of, so what criteria in this particular property or this particular place matches. And it mainly talks about the statements of, what are the statements of authenticity, the rich evidences and integrity, and how we can justify the selection of component parts in relation to the future nominations as a whole. And the last important thing is the comparison with other similar properties, because we are talking about outstanding universal values. So what are the relevant similar properties? So there are different, this is again a form, different annexures which I am just showing you how it is filled out. So the procedure is basically the state parties submit it to the secretariat, and then they forward it to the relevant advisory bodies for evaluation, and the soft copies are also forwarded to the members of the committee. So then these evaluations, they always take some time, and this, for the cultural heritage nominations, it is mostly carried out with the ICOMOS, and the natural heritage is by the IUCN. So these advisory bodies are requested to forward to the state parties with copies of World Heritage Center for distribution to the chair of the World Heritage Committee, mostly around 31st January of each year, a short interim report. It's a kind outlining the status and any issues related to evaluations, so any observations or any kind of request for any supplementary or add-on information in one or two working languages of convention, because this language is also important. Imagine when you are talking about, that's why the French or these kind of languages are mostly universally recognized. So this ICOMOS and IUCN gives recommendation in three categories. One is the properties which are recommended for inscription without reservation, properties which are not recommended for inscription, nominations which are recommended for referral or deferral. So this is how in these three categories they recommend. So I think today we learned about this whole process, how they are nominating, and in the following lectures we also talk more about this, the other aspects of the built environment, and we look forward to hear. Thank you.